He works to promote collaborative public-private dialogue and the development of regulatory environment that fosters opportunities for entrepreneurship and job creation. Dewan also provides intellectual leadership and strategic direction in the areas of financial sector diagnostics and policy advice to national financial sector regulatory and supervisory authorities to help build strong and efficient financial systems. Since joining the World Bank Group in October 2009, Dewan has focused on efforts to facilitate access to a broad range of financial services for firms and for households, and to mobilize the private sector in offering better services to the poor, ranging from housing finance and insurance to microfinance and remittances. Dewan also represents the World Bank on the Financial Stability Board in Basel. Previously, Dewan spent about 10 years at McKinsey, building extensive experience in Asia and North America. He served as Director for Asia at McKinsey Global Institute, and before that as a Director of Global Operations for McKinsey Strategy Practice. May I now welcome Dev to really give his keynote address, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, I really thank the organizers of this conference and our host country, India, for their invitation. The topic at hand, competitiveness, development, and the role of the state, I think is timely and extremely important. The financial crisis that hit in late 2008 has forced governments obviously to rethink the old dogmas and revisit topics that are long considered taboo among academics, policymakers, and yes, multilateral agencies like mine. Indeed, the World Bank is actively reflecting and evolving on its own thinking and practices in the entire arena of competitiveness, in particular industrial competitiveness. At a more personal level, I am really thrilled to be here today, as this topic is one that I hold close to my heart. As someone who grew up in Singapore and saw East Asia evolve to what it has become today, I have naturally a very strong view on the topic. Now, in the next 20 minutes or so, I would like to take a shot at answering 3 questions. I don't pretend actually to have the definitive answers to these questions, but would nevertheless throw them out, if nothing else, to spur further debate, and perhaps we could have a dialogue after this, my addressing some of these questions. The first question is, why is there all this renewed interest on competitiveness and the role of the state in the first place? Right. The second question is somewhat of a soul-searching one. Should we really be focusing our time and energy on competitiveness at a time when the development agenda is struggling to keep up with a number of other challenges that are staring us down? And the third question is as follows. If the topics you are discussing in this conference are real priorities, how should we go about addressing them? By the way, all 3 of these questions are troubling us and have troubled us in the World Bank and IFC, just as it has with so many of our clients over a number of years. To be precise, ever since the Bretton Woods organizations were formed in 1944, we've been troubled with these questions. So there's nothing new here. I do believe that a new understanding is emerging, not merely as the fashion of the day, but truly being underpinned by approaches and thinking on why long-term sustainability itself is predicated by answering these questions correctly. The global financial crisis was a serious shock to the system. Lessons from this crisis will be written about for many years to come. However, important shifts in thinking on development are already evident. For one, the crisis has in fact thrown the conventional wisdom that viewed the development process as a linear one and with predetermined outcomes into question. It's thrown all of this into question. Instead, the crisis has pushed policymakers and academics to adopt more nuanced views on strategies for development, particularly the relative importance of markets, institutions, and the role of the state. The US and Europe have pumped billions into banks and car makers. They are talking about strategic industries and are working on industrial strategies. Britain, France, Germany, and Japan have now turned toward more aggressive industrial policy. Much of the discussion I have with development partners in various client government agencies are centered on the topic of industrial competitiveness. My former colleagues in McKinsey and their competitors are advising governments on how to get it right. Books are written to examine the growing momentum towards state capitalism. And The Economist magazine claims that industrial policy is back in fashion. And this is where I precisely disagree. Industrial competitiveness never went out of fashion. Be it in electronics and palm oil in Malaysia or biotechnology in Singapore, car parts and assembly in Morocco or Central and Eastern Europe, wine from South Africa, salmon from Chile, or fresh asparagus from Peru, and the list goes on and on. In all these cases, governments played an active role in creating the foundation for sustained and strong private sector expansion and job creation. China, of course, is yet another strong case. One has to look at China's rise in manufacturing and realize how public support has benefited new industries. And for those who would rather not single out China, what about the US? We should not forget the origins of Silicon Valley or even that of the internet itself. Indeed, the proponents of the so-called Washington Consensus forgot that much of the industrial development that took place in the United States of America, that bastion of capitalism and my home country, relied on positive state-level interventions as opposed to federal-level intervention. Now, I put it to you, is there really a difference, right, between federal and state-level interventions? So the answer to the first question about why this renewed interest in industrial competitiveness is partly related to the financial crisis and the soul-searching that we've had to go through given that crisis. That brings me to the second question. Should industrial competitiveness feature as a priority in our development agendas? Private sector development is arguably the cornerstone of sustainable poverty alleviation through the creation of employment and income opportunities. The World Bank's 2000 report, Voices of the Poor, found that poor people identified getting a job, whether through self-employment or from wages, as their most promising path out of poverty. The sequel to that report, almost a decade later, Moving Out of Poverty, found that the majority of those who moved out of poverty from 1995 to 2005 attributed to finding a job or starting a business. But at the practical level, private sector development requires more than just broader policy reforms. It means building industries that can compete in global markets and create demand at home for labor, inputs, and services. In most developing countries, the private sector provides up to and sometimes in excess of 90% of all jobs. But the vast majority of firms are small and often informal, with very limited opportunities to grow. The financial crisis has further constrained growth opportunities for the private sector by shrinking the accessible market. In a context where global and regional competitiveness has become vital given limited domestic market opportunities, countries are actively looking for practical solutions to create new growth and employment opportunities. It is no coincidence that the World Bank's chief economist and my good friend, Justin Lin, openly supports work on competitive industries to address development gaps in lower and middle income countries. It is also no coincidence that within my own division, we are making this as one of the key pillars in our work towards poverty alleviation. Work that breaks across many silos of thought and knowledge, as I'll explain in a minute. For those who still doubt whether or not industrial competitiveness plays a role in development, let me put it in the same way I put to wavering colleagues of mine in the bank. Where does wealth creation take place? In the public sector? No. Does it happen magically? No. Wealth creation takes place in the private sector. And the private sector is made up of enclaves of industries. And when I talk about industries, I mean services, manufacturing, and the wider perspective. Yes, wealth creation does take place in viable industries. So how does it take place there? Through job creation. And where significantly does this job creation take place? Well, in SMEs of growth industries. But SMEs don't thrive on their own. Right? They participate in industrial ecologies, right, as part of a bigger whole. So if you want wealth creation, let's get with it. Right? It is in industrial sectors where that happens. So let me now turn to the last and most difficult question, the how. The model prevalent today is to create a level playing field through policy interventions, an approach based on removing constraints and strengthening the broader policy environment for all businesses. This has met with some degree of success, as reflected in the strong reform momentum in many developing countries. My vice presidency's doing business indicators, I think a report that many of you would have seen, has tremendous impact in focusing efforts to reform in the business sector. And we have been committed to supporting developing countries in reforming their investment and business environment for no less than 25 years by programs such as the Foreign Investment Advisory Service, now known as the Investment Climate Department of the World Bank Group, an entity which is also in my division. But the working age population in the developing world is expected to expand steadily from presently 3.8 billion to 5.1 billion by 2050, with particularly strong growth in Africa and South Asia. Employing them all will require almost 35 million new jobs each year. Governments are searching for solutions through more targeted interventions to help create these job opportunities and are increasingly turning to direct collaboration with the private sector to help unlock industries that can effectively compete in the global economy. This is not a new challenge for the development community as a whole and the World Bank in particular. Empirical and analytical work at the industry level undertaken by the World Bank Group and others shows that close collaboration between governments and the private sector holds great potential to define opportunities and remove the constraints. But let me be frank and hold the World Bank Group accountable despite its many successes. We have never approached private sector development in a holistic way. For long, we have ignored the multidimensional macro and micro complexities in delivering a programmatic private sector development approach. Too many times we have dealt with removing only the binding constraints to an attractive investment climate, for example. We have separately dealt with trade and export competitiveness, and separately again with governance and corruption issues, political accountability and capacity building. And in our delivery mechanisms, we have not integrated lending, investment, or political risk guarantees as well as we could have. Make no mistake about it, I think we need to move towards a more holistic approach to private sector development. As man does not live by bread alone, Private sector development does not take place just because the investment climate improves. What is needed is a slew of changes at the industrial level. The real challenge, and one where we have been refocusing the World Bank Group role as facilitator, lies in the government and private sector engaging jointly in the identification of potential industries and products where a country's industry would have latent comparative advantage to compete globally. Driven jointly by public and private sector champions, a partnership can be formed that drives the agenda of identifying specific opportunities as well as constraints that impede firms from competing effectively. With industry players in the driver's seat, the partnership can formulate a clearly defined and goal-oriented work program, specifying the individual reforms and initiatives required to improve industry competitiveness. Now, while some recommendations might pertain to the relationship between the actors of a value chain, many actions or reforms will be aimed at removing individual product market binding constraints at the foundational level for the given product or sector. The types of actions for a given subsector may include, among others, industry-specific policy and regulatory reforms, access to specialized financing, and we all know that access to specialized financing is frequently missing to that middle level, right, of SMEs which support any thriving cluster or industrial sector. The provision of specialized hard infrastructure, trade promotion and FDI attraction, research and skills partnerships. What are we really doing about the skills deficit, right, that we face in a number of the developing countries? The development and certification of technical standards, supply chain development, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on. There's a whole lot of arenas where we need the combined interventions of the public and private sector, and very often that is the missing link. This is what I mean by a holistic structure. You can't solve the development of the private sector by looking at singular approaches to either investment climate reform alone or skills and development reform. It never works that way. The promise of the development partners should then be to make use of all the tools in our disposal, be it financial support, government, or support to the government through its lending operations, analytics and advisory services, as well as direct investments with the private sector to deliver across all these dimensions. Let me come to a close by stating that the world has not changed radically. It is our understanding, or rather recognition, of successful policies, right, that has changed. A new paradigm is emerging, one that focuses at competitive industries as a source of growth, jobs, and wealth creation. We must be careful here. We must not constrain this as a one-size-fits-all set of policies for every country. Each country will have to find its own government and market balance, and will have to be pragmatic and take an eclectic approach in its industrial strategy. We must ensure that we nurture this new approach and build it on strong and long-lasting partnerships between the public sector, private sector, and their development partners. And that brings me to a close. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
My name is Rajveer Singh, and my question to you, sir, there are three questions. Quite often we give example of China, and we know China, there are a lot of factors responsible for the growth, but one of the important factors is their high rate of savings. They have saving rate of more than 50%. How do you compare China with other developing countries in terms of their growth pattern? My second question is, is China is a good example of private sector-led development? And my third question is, how do you sequence growth and equity? Because since last 3-4 days, it is an important question for us that is competitiveness good for equity or good for growth? Thank you.
Let me take another couple of questions and then I'll try to answer all of them. Yeah.
I'd like to congratulate for your great speech. Indeed, you're right when you mentioned that there is no size-fits-all policy. Some countries went against conventional wisdom, like my country, Brazil, since 2003, which combined some counter-cyclical measures, social policy reducing poverty and inequality through minimal allowances, and exploiting the domestic market. And also our banking system obeyed Basel II agreement. And because of that, we have improved growth, reduced poverty, increase in international reserves, and so forth. So you're right. But still, I think in our case and in other cases, when you discuss clusters and competitiveness, and you mentioned industrial policies, we seem to forget that the value addition of any industrial sector, it's based on services. Designing, logistics, post-selling services, product upgradation through downloads, applications, and so forth. Why is that so that not only economists, but development strategies in general, when they talk about competitiveness and they talk about industrial policies, they miss the target of fostering not only forward and backward linkages regarding services. Why is that so? Is that the lack of understanding of services in general?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Torgeir Reeve from the Norwegian School of Management. Thank you for a great speech. But the idea of the level playing field, which is so important both in World Bank and among most economists, does it go against the idea of an aggressive cluster policy, or is it consistent? I always get into trouble with my economist friend on that issue.
Okay.
If you could take one more. I'm Mark McCord, Deloitte North America. It seems that there's been a dissection or a disagreement in some cases between international organizations that work with governments and governments themselves and how to deal with this issue of poverty. Governments inherently want to create jobs, any kind of job, so people can work. While international organizations typically want to focus on more strategic goals, competitive industries, which takes longer and sometimes flies in the face of governmental policy. I think Gareth brought this out earlier in New Zealand's example, where they lose interest if quick results aren't achieved. How can we bridge this gap between spending hundreds of millions and billions of dollars just providing jobs that aren't sustainable versus making the case with governments that you have to be in this for the long term, you have to be strategic, and every time the government changes, you can't change your policy. You have to continue on and make this thing a reality.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if we have time, we'll come back for more questions if there are any. Let me very quickly go down some of the questions in turn. I think there were some very interesting questions about China, and I happen to know a little bit about China, having lived there for quite a few years. The first issue about China having a high savings rate. Now, that is not because the Chinese just love to save or anything. I can guarantee that it's partly due to the fact that the social safety net does not exist in China as many people would want to believe. And when you don't have a social safety net of a good retirement program, And I'm talking about the entire hinterland of China, not just the East Coast. If you don't have, a good healthcare plan, for example, you end up saving, right, in order to take care of the rainy day. But nevertheless, it has created enormous dislocations, I think, in China as well. There's this whole question of rebalancing, right, that is predicated on recalibrating Chinese savings so that there's more domestic consumption, right, that can take place. But there's serious challenges on it. And in fact, when I was in the McKinsey Global Institute, there was a study that we did to assess how you might begin to go in that direction of a rebalanced economy. In order for greater domestic consumption to take place, you need more income, right, in a way. And while income is growing, I mean, everyone knows that in China, in a number of the industries, wage rates have been kept low, either through government intervention or just through the dynamics of the huge numbers of migrants, right, coming in from the rural areas. And not only that, even at the spectrum of a different income class, dividends don't end up, right, from the state-owned enterprises to the pockets of the citizenry itself, right? The dividends are actually kept back as retained earnings within the Chinese system, and so unless you have specific protocols changing all of these, you're going to have this fundamental imbalance in China. I can go on and on about this, but I'll stop right there. Now, is China a good example relative to India? I don't think you could answer that question in a straightforward. I think there's certain aspects of what they've done which is obviously interesting. I think the way that they have tackled their infrastructure deficit has been an eye-opener not only for India but for several other large countries, right, in the world. Industrial organization, you've got to. The one thing that China walked into is that they knew how to organize themselves. It's a deficit that we find in a number of other countries. So from that perspective, can we learn from them? Some of it. Right? Some of it is very political. Right? So let's recognize that you can't just do a cut and paste, right, of taking what has worked in China to a place like India, for example. I don't think it works that way. And is it equity or growth? I said, why not both, right? I think you do require both of these, in the challenges to development. And let me sort of bring this particular question with your question, right, with regards to the so-called disagreement between the way governments approach private sector and the multilateral organizations. I think, look, one of the challenges that we face in talking with governments is exactly the issue of sustainability. And sustainability translates back to equity as well. And one of the dangers, and I'll be very frank on this, when we talk about cluster development, industrial development, the fears that, and the real fear that we have in the multilateral agencies, and as well as in our client government, is the fear of capture. Okay? Good policies can end up being captured by the wrong sets of people if you do not have good governance structures in place. And let's face it, right, there are a number of our developing countries where we face fundamental issues in governance, in containment of corruption, and so on. Right? So when we go in with taking a new stance on industrial policy and being activists on cluster development, be very careful that it's not captured by certain groups. So this is where I feel it's extremely important for the government, well, for an honest government to come in and to lead the way. I go back to some of what I have seen in countries like Singapore and Malaysia. And we forget that, in 1960s and 70s, Singapore was also known as a sin city, right? Because everything that could go wrong, or everything that is a case for corruption and governance, took place in Singapore. Now, how did they actually tackle that, right? There was some serious intervention by the government, and I think there was fortune, I guess, was on the side of the Singaporeans, that you were being led by a political leadership that was serious, right, in delivering value. So I think we face real questions. Now, the bank's role is not to intervene politically. That's not our jobs, right? But what we do believe is that there is a political economy in industrial development that we need to be cognizant of, right? Now, in this particular case, I don't want to put the entire burden on government. Private sector needs to be the check and balance as well, right? And why shouldn't they? Right? I think you get real change, right, when the private sector puts the pressure, right, on government as well, right, on issues of governance, etc. There was a question on no country being the same, value addition on logistics, packaging, and so on, and why is it difficult? Look, I think in any kind of intervention where you're trying to change industrial policy, change the industrial dynamics, the difficulty is not changing policy. The difficulty is in how you actually deliver. I happen to believe that the delivery mechanism needs to take place in a scientific way where there is actual public and private intervention, right, that takes place. We also know that the moment you bring the public and private together, it's not a hunky-dory story. It's difficult. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a messy process. But out of that messiness, if you can put some organization into it, you do see the benefits. I've seen that personally. I think Elizabeth and I were several years ago working in the case of Malaysia, I believe, as well as several others, where it was a messy process, and we saw that it was a difficult thing to do. But things began happening when you had a scientific approach to a public-private dialogue mechanism. And I always, and I tend to belittle the countries that boast that they do have public-private collaborations, and then when you dig a lot deeper, you find that it's the annual breakfast meeting with the Prime Minister or the President, and that's it. That to me is not an activist, right, intervention. And there was a question, if someone can remind me again, on the level playing field, does it go against cluster policy? Can you rephrase that? I may have missed out the nuance of it.
Sometimes it's seen as a conflict between the two issues. One is great the level playing field, and the other is to pursue an active cluster policy. So that's many economists, at least in my part of the world, would be against the active cluster policy because they think it destroys the level playing field.
Okay, but I think it comes back to the same question. I think the level playing field needs to take place. This is not when the bank talks about industrial policy and industrial development and industrial competitiveness. For several years, we faced pressure from the external world that the moment you talk about that, it means picking winners, right? And should we, as a multilateral agency, help our client governments pick winners, right? My answer to that is no, right? That is not the job of the bank, right, to pick winners. If the governments want to do it, that's completely up to them. We'll be as helpful as possible, right, in the way that they decide on the analytics of picking particular industries. I think what is more important is working with the existing base, right, of industries. That is not picking winners. You're faced with the challenge of growing a particular industry sector or a cluster, and they exist, right? So why not take advantage of that and make a serious assessment as to whether that these industries, have a viable chance, right, at transforming themselves. There's one thing I forgot to say. I think there was on the question about logistics and packaging and so on, and why is it so difficult to do? Besides the issue of it being a messy process, right, when you get the public-private interventions, what I've also seen in various industry interventions is that ultimately it's not just picking the product itself that matters. Take a look at the case of the Thai food processing industry. For a long time, right, the Thais had difficulty in breaking into the international export markets, right, on food processing, and they had a huge comparative advantage on that, right, through their resources in getting into the food business, until they did one very simple thing. Right? They got their packaging right. Right, and the way that they packaged their materials and food product that was able to penetrate the largest market, the U.S. Market, really began opening up doors. Right now, I do think that in working with the private sector, let's not forget, right, that ultimately it is profit that matters. Right, they would not be interested in doing any of this if that motive is not reinforced, and there's nothing wrong with that. Profit is good. It helps the poor, right? So I've got absolutely no qualms, right, about supporting a motive that would ultimately create jobs and help the poor. I'll take a few other questions. If we have time, that's okay. There's a question at the end.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for your presentation. It's Ibrahim Abba from Senegal. I have a question about the doing business indicators.
I'm not surprised.
About the doing business indicators and as being a way for countries to set reform agendas.
To set what?
Reform agendas for reforms. Do you really believe that countries should set reform agendas based on the doing business indicators, considering what you said earlier about one size does not fit all?
Good.
Question.
No, it's a very good question, and I'll be very blunt and say no. Right, that countries should not be basing their entire decisions on doing business. That was not the intention, right, of the doing business indicators. Doing business indicators measures 9 specific categories or buckets, right, of indicators, and within these, I think there are about 33 more granular indicators. You and I know, right, and anyone in the private sector knows that what affects the bottom line are 1,000 more, right, of such indicators. We simply cannot measure all of them. Some of them cannot be measured, period, right? So, but what doing business has done, I believe, and this is why I fervently support the report of the bank, and mind you, we do get, tomatoes thrown at us in some countries because there's some people who don't like it, right? What it has done is it has enabled us to have an open dialogue. Not only us, but the engaging with the public sector as well, to ask why is it that we cannot make improvements, right, in the business climate more of a vigorous stance, right? Why can't we take a more vigorous stance on it? No, so as a door opener to have discussions with the government, with the private sector on how we can help, right, in engage with the constituents in a country to begin to look at these things, it has really been very beneficial. Unfortunately, the moment you put it in the form of ranking, no one likes it, right? Or it depends on which side of the ranking you're on, right? If the people at the top, right, often come to us saying, how do we guarantee that we stay at the top, right? And of course, the people at the bottom are throwing the rotten tomatoes at us. But I think that it serves its purpose. In the past 8 years, I believe, Ivan, it's been for DB. In the past 8 years, it has actually given us an enormous window into advising governments on how they can make reforms that go beyond the doing business indicators. Our idea is not to go into countries to say, well, this is the way that you can tweak this indicator to improve your ranking. That's not the purpose of the indicators. Our purpose is basically to have a much more vigorous debate that opens up investment climate issues in a much bigger way. Having said that, I still stand by that investment climate is not the only thing, right, that you need to do to improve the business environment. I think it goes beyond that. We've talked about cluster interventions in skills and capabilities and so on. They've got nothing to do with the investment climate itself. It's about providing institutional, right, backing, right, to support these capability building exercises.
Just make a comment on this, because in the Latin American case, compare Brazil to all the countries like Colombia and Chile. In Brazil, we always try to break its enrollment because we didn't like the ranking position of Brazil. And when you compare to Colombia, for instance, actually it opened a dialogue. And Colombia has improved rapidly in the past 5 years, becoming the first country in the whole Latin America because they use it as a parameter, not as something that was going to be a track, but as a way to reflect the challenge that the country had.
Absolutely, and I tell you one more thing. Talking about Colombia is one great example. The other example is actually Mexico. It's a large economy, and what the Mexicans have done is they've come in forcefully to say, well, doing business is great. It gives us a relative ranking of how we look, compared to other countries. But what is more important to us is how does the Mexico compare to the state of Chihuahua, right, or to the other provinces. Now, what they've done is they've gone down to the subnational level, and in doing so, they've raised a healthy competition amongst the provinces. Because you can say, right, you can challenge DB and say, you can't compare me to country X because we're so different. And I can buy that argument, right? You cannot go in within a country and explain why you're so different. You're subject to the same rules, same regulations, you're subject to the same government. Why should you be different? Why should Tamil Nadu be different from Maharashtra Street? So from that perspective, I think it is a useful tool to actually get down to the subnational level. Thank you very much.
Dev, thanks a ton, and a small token of appreciation from our side. I think it was one of the most stunning sessions that we've actually had during the conference, and